I hated my mom. I didn't just dislike her. I truly felt a deep sense of embarrassment every time I had to be around her. She wasn't like the other moms, and it wasn't just because she was different, it was the way she was. My mom ran a small, run-down shop at a flea market. She would collect little weeds and other random things to sell just to make ends meet. It wasn't glamorous or cool, and I couldn't understand why she had to do that. The other kids at school would always talk about their moms in such high regard. Their moms didn't have to work so hard, and they looked normal, pretty, and didn't have any obvious flaws. But mine, she was so different. She didn't fit the mold of a typical mom. I remember one particular day during elementary school. It was field day, and I saw her standing there in the distance. I could feel the panic rise within me as she waved, hoping to catch my attention. She was there with her one eye, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been updated in years. I wanted to disappear, to not be associated with her. How could she do this to me? I couldn't understand why she would come to the school, making me feel like a freak in front of everyone. I threw her a hateful look and ran away as quickly as I could. I wanted to bury myself in the ground and pretend that moment never happened. The next day, my classmates found out about my mom. They taunted me, calling me names, and making fun of her, of how she only had one eye. I could feel the humiliation burn on my face as they laughed and pointed at me. It felt like the worst thing that could happen to me. I was so angry, so resentful of her for making me feel like this. In my mind, I started wishing that she would just disappear, that I wouldn't have to deal with the embarrassment anymore. I even went so far as to say to her, "Why don't you just die? You're only going to make me a laughing stock with your one eye." I regretted it immediately after I said it, but at the same time, it felt like a relief, like the pressure was finally gone. I didn't think about the pain I might have caused her. That night, when I woke up and went to get a glass of water, I saw her crying in the kitchen, so quietly, almost like she was trying to hide her pain from me. I felt a sharp pang in my chest as I looked at her, but instead of comforting her, I turned away. It was easier to keep pretending that I didn't care. I hated that she was crying, but at the same time, I couldn't let go of my resentment. I told myself that one day, I would leave all of this behind, and I would never have to face the embarrassment of having her as my mom again. I never expected that I would say those words to my mother, but I did. Looking back, I still can't believe how cruel I was. After the humiliation at school, my anger only grew stronger. I couldn't bear the thought of being associated with her anymore. The kids at school kept making fun of me because of her, and every day felt like a constant reminder of how different she was from everyone else's mother. I hated it. I hated that she wasn't like the other moms. I hated that she couldn't just be normal, like everyone else's mom who had a good job, who didn't embarrass their kids. The more I thought about it, the more it ate at me. My mind kept racing, imagining how much better life would be if I didn't have to deal with her anymore. It wasn't just about her eye, it was everything. The way she worked so hard just to make a little money, the way she wore clothes that didn't fit in, the way she seemed so out of place compared to the other moms. All of it just made me feel so uncomfortable. I wanted to be a normal kid. I wanted to fit in. And my mom, with her one eye, made that impossible. One evening, after the teasing at school had reached a boiling point, I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped. I told her in the most hurtful way I could, "Why don't you just die? You're only going to make me a laughing stock with your one eye. Why don't you just disappear from this world? It would make everything easier for me." The words came out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted saying them. But at the same time, there was a strange sense of relief. Finally, I had said what I had been thinking for so long. Finally, the anger and resentment I had been holding inside were out in the open. But when I saw her reaction, when I saw the pain in her eyes, that's when I started to feel a different kind of regret. My mom didn't say anything. She didn't yell at me, didn't scold me, didn't even get upset. She just quietly nodded, and I could see the hurt on her face. In that moment, something shifted inside me. But instead of apologizing, I just walked away, not wanting to face the reality of what I had said. I told myself that it didn't matter. I tried to convince myself that I had done the right thing. After all, I needed to escape this life, this embarrassment, and get away from her. I didn't want to the guilt didn't hit me right away. In fact, I didn't really feel much of anything at first. When I saw her crying that night, all I could think about was how I had finally let out everything I had been holding inside for so long. She was just sitting there in the kitchen, her back hunched over slightly, like she was trying to hide her tears from me. She didn't even make a sound. It was as if she didn't want me to know how much my words had hurt her. And part of me almost wished she would cry louder, or shout at me, or do something that would make it easier for me to deal with. But she didn't. She just sat there quietly, her single eye reflecting the faint light from the kitchen. For a split second, I felt a sharp pinch in my chest. The kind of feeling you get when you know you've done something wrong, but are too afraid to face it. But instead of going to her, instead of apologizing or comforting her, I turned away. I couldn't bring myself to face the consequences of my words. I was still so angry at her, still so ashamed of everything she represented. I told myself that she was the reason I felt trapped, the reason I couldn't fit in with the other kids. It wasn't my fault. She was the one who had put me in this position, and she had to understand that. But even as I walked away, I couldn't stop thinking about her sitting there, so small and broken. She didn't fight back, didn't raise her voice. She just let me hurt her, and I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me felt bad for her, but the other part still held on to that resentment. The part that wanted to leave her behind, to escape the shame and the reminder of everything I hated about my life. In the days that followed, I tried to push the memory of her out of my mind. I kept telling myself that I had done what I needed to do. I had stood up for myself. I had finally gotten the chance to express my anger. But deep down, I knew something was off. I couldn't ignore the way her quiet sobs echoed in my mind. I tried to bury the guilt, but it was there, gnawing at me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I had hurt her, how much I had taken her love for granted. It wasn't until later, when everything in my life seemed to be going right, when I had moved away, gone to college, and built a life for myself, that I started to understand. I began to realize that her love for me, her sacrifice, had been there all along, even though I had never seen it. I promised myself that I would never end up like her. I hated the life I had growing up, and I hated the feeling of being trapped in a world where my mother's poverty and her one eye were the only things that defined me. I swore that when I was older, I would get as far away from her as possible. I would become successful, build a new life for myself, and forget about the embarrassing memories of my childhood. I couldn't let my mom's life be my story, so I worked hard, harder than I ever had before. I studied for hours, determined to break free from the life she had given me. I wanted to show the world that I wasn't like her, that I could make something of myself. So, I left her behind. I left our small rundown town and moved to Seoul to chase after my dreams. The city was different. It was fast-paced, full of people who didn't know my story or my past. It felt like a fresh start. I'd buried myself in my studies, pushed myself to excel in everything I did. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to make it. And in time, I succeeded. I got accepted into Seoul University, something I had never even dared to imagine growing up. Years passed, and everything started to fall into place. I graduated, landed a good job, and eventually got married. I bought a house, a beautiful one. It felt like I had finally done it. I had escaped everything that had held me back. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had control, like I wasn't chained to the past anymore. I had built a successful life for myself, one that was completely separate from the embarrassing reality of my childhood. But then, just when I thought I had left everything behind, something happened that I wasn't ready for. One day, out of nowhere, my mother came to see me. She showed up at my new house, still with her one eye, just like before. It felt like a nightmare. My little girl was frightened by her, and I could feel the panic rising in me. I tried to pretend like I didn't know her, like she wasn't my mom. I even yelled at her, telling her to leave, telling her she was scaring my daughter. I screamed at her, "How dare you come to my house? Get out of here." I couldn't believe she was standing there, trying to ruin everything I had worked so hard for. She didn't argue though. She just apologized quietly, saying she must have gotten the wrong address and left. And for a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief. She didn't recognize me, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, I could keep living my life without her ever coming back. I convinced myself that I wasn't going to care about her anymore, that I was done with her. But little did I know, that moment would haunt me for the rest of my life. I thought I had left the past behind. I thought I could live my life without ever having to face the mistakes I had made. After all, I had worked so hard to escape everything that came with my mother. With her one eye and the constant embarrassment I felt growing up, I had built a successful life for myself, one that was nothing like the poverty-stricken, humiliated existence I had once known. I married, had kids, and even bought a house. It was everything I had ever dreamed of, everything I thought would make me happy. I was finally free from the chains that had held me back for so long. But then, everything changed in an instant. One day, I received a letter about a school reunion. At first, I was hesitant to go, but curiosity got the better of me. I told my wife I was going on a business trip, knowing that I couldn't face her or anyone else from my past. I didn't want them to know what I had left behind, how much I had tried to bury. I decided to go to my old town instead, just to see what had become of the place I grew up in. When I arrived, I didn't know what to expect. I hadn't been back in years and everything seemed different. But then, as I walked past the shack we used to call home, I saw her, my mother. She was lying on the cold ground, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. She had fallen, and there was no one there to help her. It was like the world had stopped for a moment. I could barely breathe, but at the same time, there was no sense of sorrow. No tears. I didn't feel the grief I should have felt. I just stood there, numb. In her hand she held a letter. It was addressed to me. With trembling hands I opened it and read the words she had written, words that I never imagined would come from her. She told me how much she missed me, how proud she was of me, and how sorry she was for only having one eye. But the hardest part to read was when she explained that she had given me her eye when I was a child. I had lost my own in an accident, and she couldn't bear the thought of me growing up with only one eye. So she made the ultimate sacrifice, giving me her own so that I could see the world through both eyes. She never once resented me for anything, even when I had been cruel to her. In that moment, I realized how wrong I had been. I had spent my whole life running from her, thinking I could escape her sacrifice and love. But now, standing there reading her letter, I realized just how much she had given for me. I had taken her love for granted, and I had wasted so many years hating her for things I didn't understand. My world shattered in that instant. I didn't know how to make up for the pain I had caused her, how to undo the hurt I had inflicted. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never be the same again. I never thought I would find myself standing in front of her again. Especially not after all I had done to push her out of my life. I thought I had finally broken free, built a life that had nothing to do with her. I had become successful, moved to Seoul and made a name for myself. I had a family, a home, and a future that felt secure and free from the shadow of my mother's one-eyed past. I never expected to see her again, yet there she was, standing at my doorstep with her weathered face and that same one eye that had haunted me for so long. It felt like a punch in the gut. When she came to visit, I was terrified. My daughter was scared of her. She didn't recognize her as my mother, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I wanted her to. I tried to distance myself, pretend like she wasn't there, as if it was all a bad dream. I couldn't stand the thought of her ruining the life I had worked so hard to build. I wanted nothing more than for her to disappear, to leave me alone and never come back. But of course, that wasn't how it happened. I lashed out at her, screaming, "How dare you come here? Get out of my house." I was ashamed of everything she was. Ashamed of her eye, ashamed of the way she had lived, ashamed of the way she had always tried so hard to be a good mother despite the circumstances. I didn't care about her feelings in that moment. All I could think about was how she had ruined my life, how she had embarrassed me for all those years. She didn't argue. She didn't fight back. She simply apologized quietly and said, "I'm so sorry. I must have gotten the wrong address," before turning and leaving. And for a moment, I felt relief. She didn't recognize me. I didn't have to face the guilt or the shame. But deep down, I knew I had failed her. I had failed to see the woman who had given everything for me. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had to move on and forget what had happened. But something inside me couldn't let go of the feeling that I had done something unforgivable. I had rejected her, pushed her away when she had only ever loved me. The pain of it started to creep in, and I began to understand just how much I had hurt her. I wasn't sure how to fix it, but I knew one thing. I could never unsee the truth. I wish I could say that I figured everything out right away, that I immediately understood the depth of my mistakes. But the truth is, it wasn't until much later, when my life had already started to feel stable, that the full weight of my actions hit me. After I had built the life I wanted, a life far removed from my mother and her struggles, I thought I had finally won. I thought that by distancing myself from everything I once knew, I could leave behind the shame I had felt for so long. I had a family, a home, success, all the things I thought would make me happy. But deep down, there was something missing, something I couldn't name at the time. It was only when I found my mother's letter, the one she had written to me, that I understood what I had been running from all these years. The letter revealed everything. In it, she apologized, even though there was no need for her to. She explained how much she missed me, how proud she was of me, and how she had always loved me despite my cruelty. But the most shocking part, the part that completely shattered me, was when she revealed the truth about her eye. She had given it to me when I was young and had lost my own eye in an accident. She couldn't bear to watch me grow up with such a visible handicap. So, she sacrificed her own eye, giving it to me so that I could see the world through both eyes. She did it without hesitation, without expecting anything in return, because all she had ever wanted was for me to have a better life. When I read those words, everything I thought I knew about my mother came crashing down. I had spent my whole life resenting her, hating her for the things she couldn't give me, for the way she had embarrassed me. But I had no idea of the sacrifice she had made, the pain she had endured in silence for my sake. My mother, who I had pushed away so many times, had only ever loved me with all her heart, and I had never once acknowledged that love. I had never stopped to consider the depth of her sacrifices. The guilt overwhelmed me. I felt sick to my stomach. How could I have been so blind? How could I have rejected her, not understanding that she had given everything for me? In that moment, I realized how wrong I had been to push her away, to think that she was the source of my shame. The truth was, she had always been my greatest strength, my greatest supporter. Even if I hadn't seen it, now it was too late to tell her I was sorry. The damage had already been done. All I could do was live with the regret and hope that one day, somehow, I would find a way to make things right. But for now, all I could do was remember the woman who had given me everything, and finally understand just how much she meant to me.